Hi everyone, welcome back to Into the Metaverse. This is episode 3 of season 2 and we're ready to chat more about the convergence of the Metaverse, Web3 and the creator economy from the investor perspective. With us today is Jarrod Dicker. He's entrepreneurial technology and media executive at the Churning Group. TCG is a multi-stage investment firm dedicated to building consumer businesses. Jarrod was formerly the CEO of Poet, a decentralized media platform, and prior to that served as VP of Innovation and Commercial Strategy at the Washington Post, where he founded RED, the Post Research, Experimentation and Development Team. His resume also includes roles with the HuffPost, Rebel Mouse, and Time Magazine. Welcome, Jarrod. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
This podcast is brought to you by Roundhill Investments, the advisor to the Roundhill Ball Metaverse ETF. The Roundhill Ball Metaverse ETF, which trades on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol METV, is the largest dedicated metaverse fund in the United States. The ETF tracks an index developed by Ball Metaverse Research Partners, a metaverse-focused indexing and research company headed by industry expert Matthew Ball. For a prospectus and more information, please visit roundhillinvestments.com/ETF/METV. Read carefully. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. Investors should consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses carefully before investing. Distributor Foreside Fund Services, LLC.
Okay, so diving right in, Jarrod, and if you've listened to our previous podcast, you'll know that what's coming. We love to start with a first question, which we ask every guest, and it's been quite valuable in establishing some level of consensus around how do we define the metaverse. And so to you, to your colleagues at the Churning Group and the companies you're investing in, how do you define the metaverse? And along that, maybe even more importantly, what do you believe the metaverse is not?
Yeah. So the main component for me around the definition of a metaverse is that it is decentralized. I think that, in the conversations that are being had, across Twitter and elsewhere, it's very, I'd say, open and loose as to how metaverse is really being categorized. And, people think of gaming, people think of virtual worlds, but I think the most important thing is that, it is an augmented extension to people's physical lives into the virtual world. And I think that needs to respect, the same values that we have in the physical world, which is, we make decisions ourselves, we live in our own homes, we have our own relationships. We're basically at liberty and have the agency to do as we wish. And I think that that's a massive component to how we need to be thinking about the metaverse. What the metaverse is not, in my opinion, hopefully others agree, is a closed platform system. A lot of the narrative happening today, especially in companies like Meta, formerly of Facebook, and other sorts of platforms, is that, there is going to be this virtual world that is completely contained and exists within a platform. And I, in fact, think that it's very much the opposite. I think that when we think about the metaverse, there's going to be many different worlds and arenas that individuals are creating, brands are creating, publishers, companies, you name it. And it's really going to be up to the individual agency to be able to decide how they move in between all of these different experiences. And that's where I think the kind of technical innovation, probably the hard problems to solve, but the more exciting problems to solve are really going to reside, right? Where, if I am a part of, the Grateful Dead metaverse because I enjoy that music and that community, what are the permissions and accessibility for me to go into the Bluey metaverse, which may be meant for children, or, another sort of metaverse that may be more gated or restricted. And, I feel that a lot of the, I'd say, attractiveness of having a closed metaverse is being able to control those sort of things. But I think that's also going to be the challenge, right? I think when you think of Facebook or Meta having their own virtual worlds, in what world, right, are 8-year-olds who have certain interests and 16-year-olds who have certain interests and 50-year-olds who have certain interests want to live in the same environment? It's going to be very different. There's going to be different values, kind of attributed to these sort of experiences. There's going to be different things that people want to do. So where I like to spend time and what I get most excited about is really kind of leaning in on how a bunch of these vertical worlds are going to be created and then how individuals are going to have the power, the agency, certain technologies to be interoperable in between all of these experiences. And that's where I think we're going to see the most momentum and the biggest shift of understanding as to how, this is a direct bridge as to what we do in the physical world and, what we're going to be doing in these more virtual spaces.
I think you hit on a lot of key points that Yon and I totally agree with, and that prior guests have talked about with us as well. You talked about empowering creators. It's something we spoke about with Ryan last episode. We spoke about that with Rev. Democratizing real-time 3D development. Talked about doing that in an open way with Mark Petit from Unreal Engine. I think there's a large consensus around empowering people. Taking the version of the internet we have today, Web2, this social mobile era, and kind of breaking down these walled gardens that have built. And maybe it's a little optimistic and altruistic of me to think that this is possible, but I just like, if the metaverse is the internet built by game developers, Ryan Gill, season 1 with us, have you ever played a bad video game for a long amount of time? It's very difficult to play a bad video game. And so, if we're really going to make these experiences more immersive and it's not just algorithms pushing trashy news content to us, I really think that there's an opportunity for real discoverability of things that you have an emotional connection with. And so I think that really empowers creators and consumers and hopefully, helps to tear down these walled gardens that have been built.
Yeah, and that's where I think the exciting part is. We're seeing early iterations, like you mentioned, gaming. So many of these Web3 type companies, whether they're like a PFP NFT project or insert any kind of work or experiment happening there. The natural progress right now is a game, which I think is wrong, right? I feel like there's a small blueprint of what's been done before, and it's drop NFT project, airdrop token to keep people engaged, maybe more NFTs, and then, oh yeah, you could use this in a game. And while I think that sort of experimentation is necessary and I'm excited about it, what the bigger opportunity really is how people really start to experiment and define what this thing could become. So a lot of these virtual worlds, right? The characters look and feel like us. They're walking through doors, they're driving cars, but the metaverse could be something completely different where we could be flying or, our identities are not, people with faces and bodies. There's all of these kind of new areas and arenas that could be experimented in. And that's what I think is most important for us to encourage. You hit on something great too, which is something I talk about often, especially as we think about the metaverse gaming environment, is that, people want to play games that are fun. People have deep passions that they really want to lean into. They want to use tools that are efficient and have experiences, that they enjoy. And it feels like a lot of the early experiments so far, mainly because a lot of Web3 is financialized, are really around earning money or being able to exit, not really wanting to stay within an ecosystem. If a floor price goes to X, you're going to exit that. But if you actually enjoy being there, and if we build experiences where people want to spend time, then that's not going to be the case, right? The case is going to be, you're going to want to hold on to this, you're going to want to be a part of it. So encouraging that and incentivizing those sort of behaviors is where I think a lot of unlocks will be. We did an investment in a company called Zed Run, which is a virtual horse racing platform I'm sure you and your audience is familiar with. And that's a phenomenal product, right? People are horse racing enthusiasts, people enjoy sports betting and gambling. And to date, right, because of a lot of the physical limitations and financial limitations to what goes into being able to be a part of horse racing, it's hard, right? You may not be near a track. Many 99.999% of people can't buy a horse and breed a horse. But now all of a sudden, there's this environment that's existing within the metaverse where anyone could buy a horse, they could breed, they could train, they could race, they could partake, and it starts to become a more 24/7 type environment that is way more inclusive, allows more people who have that general interest within that realm. And more of those things are kind of what I'm most excited about.
And it's an interesting couple of observations also, Jarrod, knowing where you're coming from, working with, with the Churning Group, because I've listened to a really great podcast episode with Peter Chernin, who explain sort of the strategy behind some of the bets that, the Churning Group have made over the years, like, Crunchyroll and some of these media outlets that have been very, very specific on a certain niche. And I think in a way, it's really interesting what's happening now, we are in the very early days. We're like in stage one of where the internet was in kind of 1995 to 2000, where you have seen sort of translation of other media formats, mostly print, into the internet. And I think what we're seeing on the one hand, we're seeing a lot of products that are coming into Web3 that are essentially a copy of something that existed in the current version of the web, right? And that's okay. That's kind of the first iteration. And even in gaming, right? There's a lot of gaming companies now that are, okay, we're going to build the first person shooter. It's just going to be on Web3, but it's basically a first person shooter, right? And there's a lot of first person shooter games and RPG games that have been built over the last 20 years, which I think is part of the reason why a lot of gamers are struggling with, wait, why would I go to Web3? Basically, you're giving me the same type of product. And I think there's going to be more and more education in that front. The other example you gave, Zedrun, which is a great example, which really resonated with me listening to Peter Churning talking about kind of some of the bets that TCG have made over the years, which is it's a very specific community that cares about horse racing, passionate about horse racing. Maybe it's someone new who learned that they're passionate about horse racing now that they actually own a horse. And it's a very niche community that can evolve into so much more. And so it seems like even in Web3 and metaverse opportunities, you guys are kind of taking a similar stand to some of the previous bets that TCG have made. And I think for our audience, it's really interesting to think about what does that mean for opportunities down the line? And most importantly, Jarrod, I want to echo what you said, which I subscribe to as well. The metaverse is not going to be, the exciting things about the metaverse are likely not going to be what existed before. Just like no one could have imagined something like Instagram being born. No one could have imagined Snapchat being born when Google was started, when Amazon started. No one really thought about these type of services because also the technology was not there. And I think this is why seeing the fundamental work that is being done by companies like, NVIDIA and Epic and Roblox and other in building these sort of capabilities, I think there's a lot of other technologies, of course, on blockchain as well, which will enable completely new consumer offerings and experiences that, probably at the moment don't really exist. And I get excited about that also as an entrepreneur of what could we build and how do we invent the future in a way that would fit sort of a humane representation of what the metaverse could be.
Yeah. And like the point that you make on passion, I think is a massive opportunity for Web3, right? Like arguably, it is the most kind of cultish, obsessive, passionate type community around anything being built out of this space, right? Like people have moved from tokens to decentralized finance, DeFi to NFTs, and all these things have similar principles and unlocks, but it's a rabid fan base of people who truly believe in the power of what this could unlock and are really trying to press it against like all corners of the internet to see exactly how it'll impact those things. And those are like the biggest businesses, again, like from a Churning point of view that we've seen, right? We have MeatEater, which was basically this passionate audience, around like hunting and sustainability and fishing that, has then grown out. And like we've done Hodinky, which is people who just love watches, right? Want to collect, want to trade, want to understand what's top of mind. And then those audiences grow. And we see a lot of correlations there, right? Like when you look at Web3, I'm going to botch these numbers now, but at like one point, right, like OpenSea had 1 million users, but was doing like 8 billion in GMV monthly, right? So like the average revenue per user on OpenSea was absolutely massive as it related to their volume versus what we've seen in like the Web2 environments, which was all about scale, and everyone within the audience was basically equated the same, give or take some nuance on their cookie data, but everyone was like worth $1, right, to an advertiser. Where now all of a sudden you have this environment that's happening throughout the entire ecosystem where people are spending money, they're earning money, and they're driving an insane amount of average revenue per user for those platforms. And those are the same things that we've seen in these passionate kind of like media communities, right? Like the super fan in Zed is spending a lot of time, attention, money, and support on the platform. Same with Hodinky, same with MeatEater. So to think of Web3 as a business around passion, I think is a really smart move. Like not only just from how it starts to get more detailed in its certain industries, whether that's a Zed or a Rabbit Hole or Altered State Machine or Medallion or any of these companies. But even at the foundation of it, it was actually built in that sort of way. And that's something that should be harnessed and leveraged to build out all of these experiences.
Mediator is one of my favorite shows, so I'm glad you brought that up. It's fantastic. And we've talked a lot about it. And I just want to explicitly kind of flush this out with you, because there's a lot of portions of metaverse, broad definition of the internet, right, powered by real-time 3D. But you mentioned decentralized as a core tenet, but decentralized can also mean a lot of things. In most people, it goes directly to collectively known as Web3 technologies, blockchain, NFT, etc. But there's a lot of people who argue we don't necessarily need that, or we don't know if we need that yet because it's still so early. So, just, kind of to drill into it and flush it out, how does quote unquote Web3 decentralized blockchain technologies fit into your definition of the metaverse? And how do you see traditional technologies potentially playing a role as well?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree. Like, I don't believe that these existing or emerging ecosystems, especially ones with incumbents, like in gaming or virtual worlds or media, I don't think it necessarily has to be binary, right? I think that's like a mistake for many of us as we think through like Web 2 or Web 3, where, it really should be Web 2 and Web 3. And I think a lot of the things that are going to click most, especially with people that are new entrants into this space or starting to hit like an inflection point of interest through a certain vertical, whether that's fashion, gaming, sports, they're going to be most attracted to really seeing like what components of Web3 really unlock versus just completely eliminating the experiences that they love and trying to foundationally build it from Web3. Many of which, right, the largest, and a lot of like critics against Web3 say this all the time, and many are correct. Like, a lot of these Web3 platforms are built on AWS, right, which is a centralized cloud type solution, right? And I think that that's very true. So I think it's like very valuable to identify different components of what Web3 starts to unlock. Of course, I mentioned the financialization side of it. The ownership side, I think, is tremendous. In gaming, there's a lot of promise there, right? Where you can purchase in-game assets, then move them to other games. Again, like, anyone who is deep in gaming knows how technically challenging that really is, and how many different games have to buy in order to do that. And that's a trend, I think, across the board with Web3. Like, one of my earlier companies, Poet, the whole idea was, okay, let's put digital IP on chain. Back in 2018, people thought we were fucking crazy. I mean, now it's, a $20 billion business. So just timing is everything. But, there were a lot of challenges that we faced there, right? Like, one was just getting the market educated and excited about it. But the other was, okay, like, sure, a lot of musicians are going to agree before I put anything put anything onto the internet, I'm going to mint it on chain. I'm going to mint my song on chain. I can manage the permissions. Maybe there's things I could do about data and licensing. But then all of a sudden you need Spotify to pick that up. You need YouTube to pick that up. You need all of these supporting platforms to really start to accommodate and invest engineering resources in order to do it. I think that is coming, right? I don't think necessarily there's going to be this like stopgap for all of these companies where, the Epics and the Spotifys and the Netflix or the YouTubes, I guess more like social type platforms, are going to say, no, we're not going to do this. I think 3 years ago, it wasn't necessarily a priority. I think now it's starting to accelerate a bit more, but people are trying to be more mindful of it. So I don't think, Web3 needs to be the core component in order for things to be truly decentralized. I do believe that at its foundation, that is the ethos and the philosophy behind it and what the technology does. So things that are foundationally built on Web3 will, in reaction, have that. But I do think that there is kind of an iterative approach that could go into these things. I mean, another great example, just putting on my media hat from when I ran the business at WAPO, it's like, if you ever looked at like the ad tech mapping, or Lumascape, they call it. It's like 1,000 companies that do a ton of different things. Nobody knows, right? Like, where they play or, how they partake. That's so decentralized. I mean, that like map itself is so decentralized. All of these different players manage their own things. People have to connect the dots. Now, is it like true to the philosophies of how we want decentralization to work in the Web3 environment? No, but is it technically defined as decentralized? Absolutely. So I do think being mindful of those things and being thoughtful is key. In the end, right, I think where Web3 really needs to focus and nail outside of just the technical components is like building things that people actually want, right? You have to understand the passions and why people love to do things. Do I love play to earn games? Absolutely. Like, I think they're fun. I think there's a ton of other value around them, whether that's people being able to earn online or learn online or, you know, the like X to earn type phenomenon. But on Saturdays, do I take my twins to the arcade and spend like $50 and love every second of it? Absolutely. Right. So like, I do think there needs to be a world, you know, where a lot of these things exist. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the narrative, because it's such an emerging and, you know, in fact, accelerating industry where a lot of money is flowing in, a lot of people are making a lot of money, a lot of talent is moving here, that there, you know, just by matter of fact has to be this like conflict and argument. But by no means in my mind should it be binary. In fact, I think there's going to be a lot more acceptance and opportunity for this to move faster if we are more rational around, you know, what excites us on either side of the fence.
And I think a key takeaway from what you just talked about, Jarrod, is for me, and I think for our audience as well, it's important. We should try and not be too deterministic here about Web3. It's not like, okay, Web3 is the way, everything else is going to disappear. Like some of the biggest companies in the world are quote unquote Web2, right? And so I think the key is that there's going to be, it's not a zero-sum game. There's going to be an evolution, not a revolution. No one is going to take Meta and cut the head, you know, in the middle of the square of town square. It's going to be an evolution that happens over the next decade. Some of these companies will adapt the philosophies of Web3 and why people care about decentralization. And probably those companies have a chance of building valuable businesses and enterprises over the next 10, 20 years. Some of the companies are not. They're going to fight. They're going to resist what decentralization and Web3 means, and may not have a chance of building, you know, everlasting businesses over the next 10 to 20 years. But it's obvious that there's fundamental shift of technology. It's obvious that there's some human behaviors that are now being introduced because of decentralized technologies that didn't exist. Fundamentally, they did. Jarrod, like you talked about earlier, we have a unique voice. We are non-fungible humans by definition,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Right. And so we want to be non-fungible owners of stuff that we want to own, just like in real life. And we want to have our own unique personalities and so on and so forth. All of these things are why Web3 is so exciting and fundamental. But I take the point of view similar to what you described, that not only that these companies, the incumbents of today, are still important to the distribution of content, but also I believe they're going to be important in truly enabling an interoperable metaverse, because they have to be, some of them have to be part of the solution, right? And as someone who is building, for example, primarily today on the Roblox platform is a closed platform at the moment. I very much would like to hope that Roblox is going to integrate somehow some of these principles to enable interoperability with other platforms, other environments, and enabling so many more opportunities for, you know, creators and users. And so I think that was a really, really great point to hone in on, which is, you know, we shouldn't look at it as a zero-sum game. It's not for this government to win, this government needs to lose. There's an evolution. Everyone needs to play in the same playing field. The metaverse is an opportunity for everyone in the technology sector, everyone in media, and really almost every industry. And it always starts with consumer. So switching gears a bit. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go on. Oh no.
No,
I
go ahead.
I was just going to say on that note, like I think a lot of the like oh yeah moments will really be things that are foundationally net new in the Web3 ecosystem. To your point, like I think there's going to be platforms that want to adapt, right? But or need to adapt. But a lot of these kind of Web2 type platforms, the idea of what Web3 opens up completely conflicts with their existing business. So many will move, many won't. But I think your point is true. Like there are services that are insanely important, right? That, you know, we, especially in the Web3 space, when we get excited about things, we don't highlight enough. Like if you looked at Amazon's earnings that released earlier this week or last week, everything is up. And you think about how you would have managed COVID without like an Amazon, right? It would have been nearly impossible. Like it literally like saved lives, enabled people to like do things as normally as possible, get the things that they need. Does Amazon necessarily need to be a Web3 environment? Can AWS or some sort of like elements of that start to become that? Sure. But like I think it's like to a disadvantage to discredit the value of like what many of these platforms do bring. So I agree there. And I think it's going to be an interesting kind of like few years seeing what's net new and how we think about new things, how companies should or could evolve, and what the results end up being there.
Yeah, it's almost like for a company to be valuable, it doesn't necessarily, in order for a company to be valuable and essential, it doesn't necessarily have to be purely Web3, right? The reality is always kind of in between. The truth is in between. And I think to the case of Amazon and other companies for sure, like when you think about Disney, what are they going to do? They're going to Web3 their theme parks, right? Like probably there are elements of the Disney ecosystem that can be decentralized, right? If you talk about content and ownership of IP, I mean, how do you decentralize Mickey Mouse, right? Like let's see what happens when they do that, and giving pieces of NFTs that you go and do whatever you want on the top of Mickey Mouse NFT. I mean, I don't know. Are we going to get there? Let's see. But it's going to be interesting. So, Matthew and I both agree that on the podcast that the metaverse is really going to also turbocharge the creator economy. And I know this is an area, you've been very spoken about and incredibly passionate about. And this is one of the reasons we're also so optimistic about the development of sort of metaverse platform, metaverse environments to enable creators to do even more and reach more people and ultimately make a living that they can sustain themselves as creators, which is something very challenging today. So how does the creator economy fit into Web3 and the metaverse from your perspective, and maybe at a higher level from the TCG perspective?
Yeah. So I believe that, Web3, again, has a lot of definitions and things that it brings forth, whether that's, technical, financial, et cetera. But I do think and we saw this happen very quickly in real time. The creator economy boomed in 2020. I mean, it's always existed, but the narrative around it really started to boom in 2020 with journalists moving to Substack and the explosion of creators on YouTube and Roblox and other sorts of places. And very quickly that narrative shifted, right? It was creator economy is going to change the world, and then crypto. And I think it's because crypto really started to showcase an interesting way where new business models and organizational models could be created that help accelerate and support the creator economy in new and interesting ways. So, you've seen this through the ability for individuals to raise capital by way of NFTs or social tokens in order to launch a publication or launch an experience that they're looking for. In relation to the NFT side, I think there has always been a kind of wall, not an actual physical wall, but kind of this proverbial wall between creators and their consumers that either were managed by centralized platforms, i.e. Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, or just because of the opportunities that they were able to have. It was I create content, I do something for you, you consume it, you share it. That's really it. Maybe there's a comment section. And what I really think Web3 did for the creator economy and that sort of relationship, and I do believe people who are building in media or metaverse, when they enable Web3, need to think about it as a tool to build better relationships with their audience or their customers or their peers, is really kind of giving this notion of membership a massive kind of facelift. And what I mean by that is, you see this with a lot of the NFT projects and how people are raising capital through that. Most recently, Moonbirds. How come I can't remember?
Moonbirds.
Was it Moonbird?
Moonbirds.
Yeah, Moonbirds. Sorry, it sounded funny coming out of my mouth, but you saw it through Moonbirds and Bored Ape. But basically, right, you release these sort of NFT type projects and people buy into them and you're programming for them. But not only do you program for them, but people get value out of these NFTs, right? Maybe they could go to in-person events. Maybe they could be in private discords or conversations. Maybe they get to unlock certain IRL or metaverse type experiences because of what they hold. And it's really put more emphasis on creators to think about how they build value for their customer outside of just doing what they've always done, which was creating content, right? And that was always the value flow, right? That was the value flow you mentioned earlier from like when media was in print and you would print a magazine or a newspaper and someone would read it, and that was the value. That's what you paid for. And even broadcast television, the same, Netflix, the same, very passive type relationships between publishers or broadcasters or creators with consumers, because content was really the focus. With Web3, it really started to emerge an entirely new relationship where it's not just about this content that like the customer wants to pay for, but it's actually about this experience and relationship. And it's pushed creators to really focus on that. And that's been something I've been pretty critical on for a long time. I mean, even at the Washington Post, when I was there, and you look at a lot of these larger kind of subscription focused media brands, it's very difficult for them, I think, in terms of like prioritization and also like knowledge gaps, to really think about how they continue to build for that subscriber outside of the content itself. In the NFT world, we've seen that move pretty swiftly, right? We've seen it through like CCO, which is like, hey, look, you own this, you could build something on it. You own this Bored Ape, well, now you have Jenkins the Valet and you're signed to CAA and you're doing a book deal and so forth. Or, you know, you see it in the Nouns community and you see it in like Cryptodes and, you know, the kind of like Gremplin community. So you have like that component. You have the component of this notion of membership. And NFTs do have the power to like really change membership, both in terms of you having like a one-to-one and getting value out of it that the creator is creating. Even when you think about access and ticketing and new opportunities there, like it really starts to explode. So that's where I think Web3 really started to take over, right? It really shifted the relationship between creator and producer and customer to just be content to now being way more deeper, which is a harder focus, going back to what we were saying with like average revenue per user, lifetime value, like those sort of arenas that are starting to be invested in on the creator side means longer relationships, means better value, right? And that's where I think the like Titanic type shift really, you know, happened there. And there's a lot of more examples that we could go down for probably 3 hours, but that's like one of the biggest ones that I get most excited about. That is why I think we're seeing so many of these like community built brands or new media companies or, you know, new like metaverse type companies like taking advantage of, you know, the social token NFT type way of crowdfunding and, you know, relationship building with their audience.
One of the things you just hit on was, you know, you alluded to the music industry, and, you know, I've been pretty passionate for a while now that I think the music industry is going to be, you know, really, really hyper accelerated by the metaverse, Web3. I think it's just primed for disruption. It's been, you know, we think that it's recently been disrupted with music streaming. That's actually like a decade old now, right? You know, we're in the next iteration. We're seeing lots of platforms start up. I know TCG, you guys just invested in Doomsday X, and, you know, a former Wall Street intern of mine started a company called Royal IO. You know, they're doing music royalties on the blockchain. But, you know, just, you know, this is obviously creators, so it's speaking right to what you were just saying. But, you know, how do you think about the future of the music industry? Because like TCG has been kind of there for a long, long time, and how that collides with, you know, these massive trends of metaverse and Web3.
Yeah. So I have a ton of feelings very loosely held, mainly because I'm a massive music fan. You know, I started my career as a music journalist. You know, I've been deep in this space for a long time, mainly on the fan side. You know, I'll admit I'm a massive Fish fan. I've seen him 200 times, about to see him 4 nights in a row at MSG, starting tonight. So I'm psyched. But where I think one area that I have a ton of conviction on is really this notion of like what it unlocks for fans. And that's what really attracted me to Doomsday. You know, there's a company that we're working with called Medallion in a similar vein. There's a few others to be announced soon that are in a similar arena. But Web3, I really think, starts to unlock like what fan experiences and opportunities could really be. So, for example, Doomsday X, you know, it evolved out of Doomsday Media, which was, you know, they've produced hundreds of very famous music videos, and their arena of focus is saying, okay, like we talk about music NFTs, but what does that really mean? Well, that really means like bringing context and value around the music and the art that really gives fans something new and experiential to kind of take advantage of. their first drop was called a producer NFT, which quite simply allowed the fans to be able to buy NFTs from the artist Halik Mal. That gave them kind of producer access to Halik Mal's new music video. They filmed this music video. All the fan holders of producer NFTs were able to like experience it, get behind the scenes, see how it was created. It's launching this week, and it's a completely like fan owned and produced experience where each individual fan will now get credit, right, as a producer of that music video. So if you're a super fan of this artist, right, not only are you getting access, not only do you have this valuable collectible by way of NFT, but now at the end of that music video, it's going to say like, you know, Jarrod Dicker in the producer credits. So my IMDb now has me and my favorite artist as a producer listed there. So that's something new, right? And I believe that that's the area where you really can see an explosion when you talk about music NFTs and the opportunity there, because music fans have deep passion, right? They have deep passion for the music itself, for the artists. They're willing to spend a lot of money in order to do that. And that area I think is very interesting. Now, I think there's like two paths to, or two concentrated areas that we're seeing in music right now. One is on the artist side, which you mentioned, royal and sound and catalog, which is, you know, artists kind of like putting their music on chain, being able to sell it as NFTs, get more value, maybe control their royalties. I'm excited about that, but I do think consciously, like, there are a lot of headwinds there. Like, I think, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, like, how does Spotify accept this? A lot of top artists do actually like their labels, you know, contrary to belief, and their managers, right? And yes, there is like a longer tail that don't. And I love that area, but I do think that it will be played out in an interesting way, and I'm excited to see how that works. On the other side, it's basically saying, look, like, super fans are willing to do whatever, whenever for their favorite artist, right? And using Fish as an example, I'll fly to Charleston for 3 days, see Fish, pay for a hotel, pay for flights, go to dinners, go to after parties. We're talking like thousands of dollars just to see the band. So for me as a super fan, it's way less about me like getting like royalties from my favorite artist. I don't want money from Fish. I want to give Fish money so that Fish gives me more experiences. So that's where kind of the Web3 arena for me is most interesting. It's like artists can really think of new ways to add on value to what they already do to give fans new experiences. Medallion is another example I mentioned. So it's like very, again, quite simply, fan clubs on chain. Fans could have an artist medallion for some of their favorite artists, and by having that medallion NFT, that could give them soundcheck access, backstage access, early ticketing to the event, premiere ticketing, like all of these really cool things that really allow you to focus on your super fans and give value there. And more, I think we'll see that start to open up, right? Because the path to like the path to accessibility in the physical world is very different to the path to accessibility in the virtual world, where like my background in media and now VC and as a writer makes it very hard for me to be like a music producer or a record label owner. Like Universal's not going to hire me for that. But in the virtual world, Metaverse, I could join a DAO with a lot of like-minded smart people. Maybe it's like other VCs, maybe it's some label executives, maybe it's some artists, and we create this label DAO where now all of a sudden I'm a record label executive, like just because of the different path that I'm able to take in the virtual world. So that's where, for me, I get most excited. And, you know, especially as we look at like early stage Web3 type opportunities at TCG on the music side, that's where I believe like there's a massive passion, massive value. People like want that. It's fun. And we're really, you know, kind of focusing our energy there.
All right. So if anyone from Fish or anyone who knows anyone from Fish is listening, you should mint NFTs for fans, and Jarrod will buy all of them.
All of them. And I'll hold them. I won't sell.
Which is another thing, by the way. I think we're going to hopefully transition to a world now where on Web3 people come in to stay in the communities and the NFTs and NFTs evolve as a product versus coming to sell, which is primarily what has been kind of happening in this first generation, people flipping NFTs and so on and so forth. which is totally normal human behavior. It happens in art, in traditional art, so it's nothing surprising. But I do believe we're starting to move into a world where, NFTs become more of a product, an ecosystem that people want to be part of. You just mentioned Moonbirds as the most recent kind of sensational NFT, and so on and so forth. So, Jarrod, as we near the conclusion of this really phenomenal episode, and I do feel like we can continue and talk for hours more, I'd love to look at kind of media more broadly in the context of these emerging technologies. I recall a quote from Steve Jobs. I don't know if he actually said it or someone thought he said it, but it doesn't really matter. It's a quote from Steve Jobs for all intent and purposes, defining media really as the distribution of content over technology, right? And kind of ever evolving landscape. And so how do you envision the current media landscape being impacted by the emergence of Web3 and the Metaverse? What are some of the unique opportunities you see for existing media companies, could be current or new entrants, in the next 5 years? And within the media landscape, what are some of the key categories that you guys are focusing on at DCG?
Yeah. So what I will say is, I do believe that, at least in this early Web3 evolution, there's a massive emphasis on nailing crypto right. Like, how do we do a token? How do we do NFTs? How do we engage that community? And many discount how difficult it is to program, right? Whether that's like creating a movie, creating a show, creating a song. And that, I think, will become, more of a realization sooner than later, right? Like, you watch the new Batman, you watch a Netflix show, you even watch a short, right? Like, I have 5-year-old twins. I watch a Disney short that's 3 minutes. There's 45 people listed on the credits, right? It's like, there's a lot of people that, lean in, have an expertise that make great content. So I believe that, the existing kind of climate for media will continue to exist, right? I think that there is the Web3 community right now, and the opportunity is really around active consumption. And I think that's where we should focus versus passive consumption, right? Like, I believe if you ask, sure, many artists may have an opinion about Spotify, but ask a consumer about Spotify, you will rarely find someone who dislikes that. I mean, maybe it doesn't have all the music that they like and they have to sign up for YouTube Red or, for me, Live Fish or something like that. But for the most part, for $10 a month, all the music on your phone is an amazing experience, right? And I think same with Netflix, same with broadcast, same with newspapers, that sort of media will always be important, especially if it's quality and focused on good programming that people could lay back on the couch, read or watch. It's the active side that I really think starts to open up massive opportunities. So I mentioned CC0 before, which is really this notion of giving commercial licensing to certain creators. Bored Ape is a great example of this, where anyone who bought a Bored Ape NFT could then take that and leverage it commercially however they want. One person's opening a restaurant in Long Beach, someone built Jenkins the Valet, Universal Music bought a bunch and is creating the new Gorillas or whatever you want to call it. But that arena, I think, is interesting. Now, does that replace existing media? No, but does it create this new arena? Sure. That notion, I think, is very important, and I've hammered on that a lot just in my thinking, but we should really think of Web3 in the media space, not necessarily as a new media model or a way to replace something or add to something, but actually new genres, right? I think very similar to K-pop in music, the next large Web3 music platform or artist is going to be very similar. It's not going to be how rock artists use Web3. It's going to be this new genre with these fans who love the component of what they could do by buying in and participating, and they like the music, and maybe it's maybe it's created a generative type way or a new interesting type way. But I think that's where we're going to see a lot of the unlock and applications there. Now, something true to my heart where I think Web3 can, impact some value to the Web2 ecosystem. I mean, we're doing this at Poet. It's still top of mind today, is this notion of information being very important to your health, like what you read and what you consume directly affects, your mood, both physically and mentally. We've seen that in like the Facebook arguments of like people's news feeds who may be on the right and only get fed their echo chamber, and it just makes them more and more and more go deep down that zone. And you see it on the left or any sort of pocket. Elon is talking about it right now as it relates to Twitter and free speech. And an interesting approach to like thinking about Web3 is that as we evolve, if we could start to think about it less as a product, like this is what I've done and here's the NFT that you could use or buy, and more start to think of it like a process, right? Within my creator flow in my CMS, or when I do something, the first thing I do is mint on chain. Then there's a lot of things that can be done there. Again, I mentioned earlier, like licensing and permissioning, but when it relates to like informational nutrition, if people could start to see like the provenance of information they consume, you may not want to be told, right? You may see a video that you believe is Barack Obama that has the CNN logo that's saying something completely outlandish. It's a deep fake, but you may want to believe that. And someone may say, oh, it's a deep fake. And you're like, oh, no, that's just, the Washington Post telling me it's a deep fake. But if things start to be on chain and you can see like the supply chain of like how that was created, well, then people could just more actively like look into how things were created, whether something was manipulated, how it was used. And it just allows more exposure for people to make better decisioning. So that's one example that I think could be very interesting of how people think about, what on-chain data could mean for existing kind of media outlets, especially in news and especially in disinformation, which is, an accelerating conversation over the past decade and doesn't seem to be getting any better. So
I think that's awesome. And, we're getting close to time. I just want to sneak in one last question, and it's probably a long-winded answer, but maybe you can kind of shorten it up a little bit. We look at metaverse companies, we look at the value of crypto assets that are publicly traded. We've seen depreciation of asset prices, whether it be Roblox stock price, Unity, crypto is down from the highs that we saw last year. And you compare that to private companies, you look at, the sandboxes out there raising money at a big valuation, Decentraland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like every day there's a new Web3 crypto gaming, crypto metaverse platform raising money at some ridiculous valuation. How do you look at that? I call it a disconnect, but how do you look at that as an investor in terms of being on the private side, but you've worked at large companies in the past? How do you kind of frame that mentally?
Yeah. So you identify a trend that's very real where skepticism, or not skepticism, but what's the word I'm looking for? Speculation. Speculation comes before product in a lot of these Web3 type platforms where, people try to really understand the financial side, what the business could be, where the opportunities are unlocked. And oftentimes more than not, you are betting on what the company will do versus, traditionally how you used to look at these companies and you'd say like, what's the existing audience? What's the user growth? What's the monetization? For many of these, it's still pre-launch. Like I think Sandbox, for example, is still in alpha, and there's, an article came out yesterday that it's, going to be raising at a $4.5 billion valuation. So I think that is the environment, right, that we're kind of like living in the Web3 space. I think there are different kind of like pathways to how products are created and where, investment and accrual goes early. We at TCG definitely try to take a practical approach. Again, going back to what you were saying earlier, Yon, with like Peter's point of view around like really driving around passions. And that's like the crux of how we think about things. Like we want to make bets on companies that we believe are fun, where there's passion around them, that are going to be valuable, that are going to be practical, right? Whether that's play to earn chess, or whether that's, a company like Rabbit Hole, which we're an investor in, which is really focused on like getting more people informed and educated and experienced around Web3, or even Zrun, which, to many may sound funny, but there's like this massive fan base of people who, want to be engaging in this virtual horse race environment. So I think like we definitely are very mindful of these, on the Web3 side. A lot of my focus is really on the earlier stage. So we have a bit more control in understanding at a valuation that kind of makes a bit more sense in its stage of like where companies are building and where they're going to go. But I do think what you identified is real, right? And I think the bet, right, for many founders building in this space and many VCs, because one thing too, right, is like there's like a ton of capital, there's a ton of talent, there's a ton of product, there's like no users, right? I think there's 190 million unique Ethereum addresses, which isn't nothing, but you know, it's like compared to like 1.9 billion YouTube users, right? It's low. So it is definitely a bet on this value being created and this talent creating it and deeply understanding and trying to predict like what users will want, what people will want leading into the future is going to be able to drive value on that upside. So yeah, it's new, it's the Wild West, but I think it's very exciting. And I think based on this combo and the other conversations that I've heard y'all have with amazing guests, there's a lot of excitement and the right energy moving towards us trying to get there.
I think that's a great way to wrap up. Jarrod, thanks so much for joining us. And maybe, you know, in a couple year or whatever, you'll come back and we'll talk more about your fish NFTs that you'll get in a year.
I would love that. Anytime.